To men in power, Jeffrey Epstein was incredibly dangerous. He'd been a pimp supplying child prostitutes to wealthy elite, and he'd been caught. He knew things that could bring down some of the most powerful people on earth. He was tied to princes, presidents, and multiple billionaires. He'd been spotted at parties with some of the biggest names imaginable. If he'd shared everything he knew, there's no telling how many people could have been taken down. And then suddenly he died. Under constant watch in a maximum security prison, Jeffrey Epstein's life ended in what's officially been called a suicide, and somehow no one saw it happen. At a glance it sounds a little suspicious, and when you look into the details it just gets worse. That's why here at Fact Generation, we've broken down top 10 facts that will make you believe Jeffrey Epstein was murdered. Number 10. Epstein claims he was attacked in his cell. On July 23rd, Jeffrey Epstein was found in his cell unresponsive with injuries around his neck. According to the official report, he'd hanged himself, but many people weren't convinced. Epstein's attempted suicide, some believed, was really an attack. Sound like a familiar story? It's not the one you think. Epstein didn't die until August 10th, but less than 3 weeks before his death he was found in nearly the exact same state. Just like on August 10th, he was unconscious and badly wounded. And just like they would on August 10th, his guards claimed that he tried to kill himself. The only difference was that on July 23rd, Epstein survived. He could tell his own side of the story. Epstein denied that he'd ever attempted suicide. Instead, he claimed that he'd been beaten halfway to death by his cellmate, a former police officer named Nicholas Tartaglione. His defense attorney, David Scowen, still insists it was not a suicide attempt. He was afraid he would face consequences if he implicated anyone, Scowen says, so he kept his mouth shut and told investigators he couldn't remember what had happened. Number 9. Tartaglione was never questioned. Prison officials claimed that Tartaglione was cleared of any wrongdoing in the July 23rd incident through an internal investigation. But if they did conduct an investigation, it couldn't have been a particularly thorough one. Tartaglione says that he himself has not been questioned since July the 23rd. He denies ever having hurt Epstein. He says that he found Epstein lying in the fetal position, unconscious on the ground, and helped him. The accusations, he said, were cooked up by the guards who were tired of him complaining about the conditions in the prison. But he also claims that the guards told him to shut up about Epstein and not talk to the press. The clear message that Mr. Tartaglione has received is that if he conveys any information about the facility or Epstein's recent suicide, there will be a price to pay, his lawyer had claimed. The corrections officers know that he has information that is potentially very damaging. Number 8. Epstein was taken off suicide watch. Epstein was taken off suicide watch just 12 days before his death. He was put on watch in late July, most likely on July 23rd, after he was found injured in what guards claimed was an attempted suicide. And if he'd stayed on suicide watch, there's almost certainly a chance he would have survived. Prisoners on suicide watch are put under constant observation. They are kept in a special cell that gives the staff an unobstructed view of everything the prisoner does, and they're given daily evaluations by psychologists. Whether he was suicidal or not, many experts agree that keeping Epstein under constant watch was just good precaution. I would have had a staff member sitting there on camera 24/7 while he's in my custody, one former warden told NBC. Epstein was taken off suicide watch just after 6 days of observation. His psychiatrist, after interviewing him, said that the suicide watch was not warranted. That's a sentiment shared by those who saw him on his final days, who have constantly described him as very upbeat and not suicidal. Epstein was returned to a normal cell with his new cellmate. He died less than 2 weeks later. Number 7. His cellmate was transferred out the day before he died. August 9th was the last day of Jeffrey Epstein's life. It was also the day a federal court released thousands of pages of sealed records on Epstein's case. The names of the men accused of being Epstein's clients were exposed, with some of the names being the most powerful men in the world. A lot of important people are going to have a really bad weekend, one article quipped. Even though Epstein was no longer on suicide watch, he was still supposed to be under constant surveillance, but just hours before his suicide and right after the court documents were released, his cellmate was suddenly transferred. No one was assigned to replace him. A man who was on suicide watch just days ago was left completely alone. No explanation for this transfer has been given. Number 6. Epstein was left unobserved for hours. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't supposed to be left alone, and his guards knew it. There were orders to keep camera surveillance on him at all times, to check on him every 30 minutes, and to never leave him alone in his cell for even a second. But on the night he died, every single one of those rules was broken. Not only had Epstein's cellmate been transferred out, leaving him alone in his cell, but the guards weren't even checking in on him. On the night Epstein died, the prison was short-staffed. Only 10 of the 18 people who were supposed to be on duty had shown up to work, and the 2 men in charge of monitoring were both working overtime. Allegedly, both men fell asleep and didn't bother checking in on him for a full 3 hours, and they falsified the logs to claim they'd been doing their duty. Even then, there were 2 separate cameras that should have caught anything that happened in Epstein's cell, and both simultaneously malfunctioned on the night he died. Number 5. Epstein's suicide may have been physically impossible. According to the official report, Epstein was found dead in his cell on August 10th at around 6:30 am. The 6-foot-tall man had allegedly fashioned a noose out of a bedsheet, tied it to his bedframe, and knelt down to hang himself. No way, an ex-inmate at the facility told the New York Post nearly as soon as the story broke. Suicide at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the ex-inmate claims, is effectively impossible. Could he have done it from the bed? No, sir. There's a steel frame, but you can't move it. There's no light fixture. There's no bars, the inmate says. They don't give you enough in there that could successfully create an instrument of death. The statistics back up the claim. In the last 21 years, the prison has only seen one other successful suicide. At least one other former inmate has voiced agreement. It's next to impossible to kill oneself in jail. Number 4. Epstein's death was reported on 4chan before it was in the news. At 8:16 am, just a little over an hour after Epstein was found dead in his cell, the first post about his death broke out on the world with the title "Jeffrey Epstein Dead." Don't ask me how I know, the message read, but Epstein died an hour ago from hanging, cardiac arrest. It was posted on 4chan 38 minutes before the first report hit the news. The poster appeared to be a first responder, as the post was full of information about how they tried to resuscitate him. It was called out as a cardiac arrest at the Manhattan Federal Detention Center, one post said. Worked for 40 minutes. Epstein was in hospital for a total of 20 minutes, the Post claims, before his death was called. The FDNY has denied that the Post could have come from one of their staff, saying that the account doesn't match our medical records, but whether the details are right or not, somehow this person knew about the death before the press. "Let's just say I know" is the only explanation the Post provides. Don't need a glowy federal officer coming to my crib. Number 3. His sex ring was successfully covered up years earlier. ABC news anchor Amy Robach, in a leaked video that came out earlier this month, bitterly complained, "I've had this story for 3 years. I've had this interview with Epstein's accuser Virginia Roberts. We would not put it on the air." She wasn't exaggerating. Back in 2015, Robach had a story ready that would have exposed Epstein's prostitution ring. She had all the major details, even his connections to Prince Andrew and Bill Clinton, but somehow the story never made it to the news. Robach since released a statement saying that the story wasn't censored and it simply didn't offer enough evidence to meet ABC's editorial standards, but her own unedited statement in the leaked video tell a very different story. In the video, she said she was threatened by the UK's royal family, who threatened to cut off their ability to cover the family if Prince Andrew's secret came out. And other networks have since corroborated that. In 2015, Epstein's lawyers contacted them and asked them to keep the story from reaching the news. They succeeded. In 2015, powerful people were able to keep stories about Epstein's ring quiet. So do I think he was killed, Robach says in the tape? 100%, yes I do. Number 2. Epstein had injuries on his wrists and arms. It was Jeffrey Epstein's brother, Mark, who collected his body. But when he found him, he had far more than just injuries to his neck. There were wounds on his wrists. Mark's description is backed up by the autopsy. When he died, the autopsy said that he had contusions on both his wrists and abrasions on his left forearm, and deep muscle hemorrhaging on his left deltoid. Those are unexplained, Mark Epstein says. Was he handcuffed and struggled? Was someone holding his wrists? Mark said that he's requested the details from his brother's file multiple times, and has asked the investigators to explain how they ruled out the possibility that Jeffrey Epstein was murdered, but months later he has yet to receive a response. I was told someone was looking into it. Number 1. Experts say his wounds are more consistent with murder. Dr. Michael Baden, who sat in on the autopsy of Jeffrey Epstein, initially refused to talk to the press about what he'd seen. He was under a gag order, he told them, and it wouldn't be right for him to comment. But when the news started reporting that his death had been ruled as suicide, Baden stopped holding it in. He told press that from what he'd seen, Epstein's injuries were more consistent with murder. He points to fractures on Epstein's neck, which he said are extremely unusual in suicidal hangings. Indeed, medical researchers say that these type of fractures are about twice as common in homicides than as suicides. According to one study, they can occur in about 25% of suicides, but even then, usually only occur when the hanging is particularly violent. According to one medical textbook, a drop of about 5 to 9 feet is required for these type of injuries. They're not typical when a man chokes himself with a sheet tied to a bed frame. Baden says that the ruling of Epstein's death could have been a mistake. There's evidence here of homicide, and that should be investigated. So what do you think? Are you as convinced as we are that something else is going on behind the scenes? Let us know down below. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let us know any other lists or people you want us to cover here at Fact Generation.